Hello, we are going to finish talking about the new challenges and successes of the civil rights movement. We are still in our textbook, Prentice Hall, United States History, Modern America. You can find a more updated version of this textbook at the National Emergency Archives or the National Emergency Library. So let's begin by talking about Martin Luther King's final days. Martin Luther King understood the anger and frustration of many urban African Americans whose lives had changed little despite the civil rights reforms of the 1960s. However, he disagreed with the call for black power and sought a nonviolent alternative to combat economic injustice. After spending about a year in Chicago's slums to protest the conditions there, King made plans for a massive Poor People's Campaign. The campaign's goal was to pressure the nation to do more to address the needs of the poor. As part of this effort, King journeyed to Memphis, Tennessee in early April of 1968. There he offered his assistance to sanitation workers who were striking for better wages and working conditions. On April 3rd, King addressed his followers. He referred to threats that had been made against his life. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, King declared, but I am not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. The following day, as King stood on the balcony outside his motel room, he was struck by a shot from a high powered rifle. He died at a hospital shortly afterward at the age of 39. James Earl Ray, a white ex convict, was later charged with King's murder. Robert F. Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency in Indianapolis when he heard of King's death. RFK stopped his campaign speech to give the audience the sad news. He reminded them that he had lost his own brother to an assassin's bullet. Kennedy asked those assembled to honor King's memory by replacing their anger and their desire for revenge with an effort to understand with compassion and love. Despite Kennedy's plea, riots broke out in hundreds of cities after King's assassination. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy's life too was cut short by an assassin. Checkpoint. Why did King go to Memphis in 1968? King went to Memphis to offer his assistance to sanitation workers who were striking for better wages and working conditions, and he did this as part of his Poor People's Campaign. So, significant gains and controversial issues. King's assassination marked an important turning point. The protests for black freedom and racial equality that began in the mid 1950s crested into the late 1960s around the time of King's death. By then, the civil rights movement had made significant gains. Yet, white racism and the social and economic gap between many blacks and whites remained. New measures aimed at closing this gap tended to provoke more controversy than consensus in America. Civil rights are advanced. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s succeeded in eliminating legal or de jure segregation and knocking down barriers to African American voting and political participation. During the same period, African American poverty rates fell and the median income of African American men and women rose rapidly, as did the number of African Americans who graduated from high school. One symbol of the progress that had been made was the appointment of Thurgood Marshall as the first African American Supreme Court Justice in 1967. The following year, in the wake of King's murder, Congress passed one final civil rights measure, the Fair Housing Act, which banned discrimination in housing. Controversial issues remain. Attempts to increase the economic opportunities for African Americans and to integrate neighborhoods and schools encountered more difficulties. To achieve desegregated schools, the federal courts had ordered the use of forced busing. Richard Nixon, who succeeded Lyndon Johnson, criticized busing as a means of attaining racial balance. At the same time, the Nixon administration formally established affirmative action as a means of closing the economic gap between blacks and whites. In a short period of time, colleges and universities, businesses, and local and state governments followed the federal government's lead and implemented their own affirmative action plans to increase African American representation in schools and the workforce. Affirmative action proved controversial almost from the start. Some whites argued that it constituted reverse discrimination and violated the goal of creating a colorblind society. Justice Thurgood Marshall disagreed. 350 years ago, the Negro was dragged to this country in chains to be sold into slavery, Marshall wrote. The position of the Negro today in America is the tragic but inevitable consequence of centuries of unequal treatment. Until the nation addressed the legacy of this unequal treatment, Marshall asserted that it would not fulfill its promise of providing equal rights and opportunities to all. This debate or controversy, as you will see, remained unresolved. So, checkpoint. What gains did the civil rights movement make by the early 1970s? Well, we had attained more or less equality in housing through the Fair Housing Act. Economic equality got closer, not equal, but more African Americans were working their way out of poverty. There was legal gains, to be sure, and things were more fair in employment. So that wraps up our talk about the successes and challenges of the civil rights movement. I hope you guys are staying safe, and I hope to see you guys soon. Bye.